and I'm grateful to be able to talk about this topic. So this is a webinar about making the leap to private practice, a really hot topic for a lot of those of us in the field who are looking to figure out how we can actually go about doing this. My name is Cynthia Grant. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I work for PATH. I oversee quality compliance in the clinical work of our amazing contracted therapists. And I also have my MBA. And the reason why I feel like that's important here is that there is a business aspect to private practice that I feel like a lot of us do not get good training on in our professions. And so we're going to spend some time talking about what that means. If you're interested, I did put my contact information on here. Happy to take questions after we're done with the webinar. We are going to go through the webinar content, and then we'll leave some time for questions and answers at the end. If you have questions that you think of while we're talking, please go ahead and put those into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any technical issues, you can also put a question in there. Kara, if you could go to the next slide. So we are going to cover a lot of territory in this very short webinar. I always feel like it's important to be able to have something that you can take away at the end of a session to make sure that it's worthwhile for. We're going to talk about some suggestions. I'm going to give you some resources and really going to talk about some of the realities of starting a private practice and how you can answer the question of whether or not it is the right fit for you. Next slide. So most of you are probably here because you're trying to answer this question, or you already have made a decision and maybe you need to understand a little bit more about what this actually means. So I feel like that when I made this decision, it's now been almost 20 years, it was a very different dynamic in the past than what it is now. Making a decision to move into private practice is a very common thought that clinicians have after you've been spending time working in an agency, in a health system, in a large organization. And for many people, they're really looking to be able to have some control over the clients that you see, the income, the hours, and even just being your own boss. And so my hope is that by the end of this webinar, you'll have a better sense of whether or not you are feeling like you're ready to move into private practice. And then in particular, Kara, if you could go to the next slide, I want to clarify that private practice can mean a lot of different things. It is not the same as it used to be of how it's portrayed in the movies or one person having an office and people sitting on a couch. Private practice is just a very flexible arrangement nowadays. You can do a solo practice where you are your own business owner and all of the responsibility falls on you. Many of the people who attend today are interested in that particular area. You can also partner with a local group practice. And so that is usually when you know someone who is putting together a practice. It's often a group of clinicians who will go together. And maybe there's one person who's the owner of the practice who then has administrative support set up. Think of your front desk and staff member, someone who does the scheduling, a main number that you can call. I have experience in both of these settings. And when I started a solo practice, it was a physical office in person, and I split it with another therapist. And so I was there certain days of the week. She was there other days of the week. That helped manage some of the expenses. Over time, though, I also have joined a group practice where a friend of mine was opening up a setting, and it was really valuable to be able to have a little bit more of an office environment where I was around other people. In both of these settings, I was also working as a full-time employee in another job. And I think that that is one of the things that we're often balancing as we start to think about private practice, is that making a leap to full-time private practice looks very different than dabbling and doing a few hours a week based on your availability. The other piece that I want to point out is that you can also join a national group practice, and there is a lot of variability in the different companies that offer opportunities to be able to partner. Some of the companies like Alma and Headway are really focused on billing support. They will get you credentialed with insurance companies, and they will manage some of the claims, but they don't offer a whole lot beyond that. There are also other group practices that sort of advertise themselves more as like therapy in a box. That's something that Path and ThriveWorks are able to offer, in that it is more than just billing support. It may also be a centralized electronic health record, a medical records team, oversight with a coach or quality measures. There is just a lot more to some of these places. And obviously I'm coming from Path, and so I am going to be talking a little bit about what that means. But I just want to make sure that folks know, as we level set to start off, there is a lot of variability in what private practice looks like, and you're going to have choices. So it's not just about making a decision whether or not you want to go into private practice, but it's also what type of private practice. The other thing that I would just mention is that there is no one perfect solution. Your choice, just like mine, may change over time. And what might be right for one person at one stage in their career might not be the same for another. So let's keep that in mind as we're talking. All right, next slide. One of the biggest reasons why people love to go into private practice is for the professional freedom that it affords you. You get to be your own boss. You set your own hours. For me, I started my private practice after I had my second child. He was young, and I knew that I needed to be able to have very flexible hours. You get to choose when you're in private practice how much you want to work, which also means that you get to have some control over how much money that you're making. There are trade-offs, though, with private practice, and part of building a private practice is that all of the responsibilities are going to fall to you. So you are going to, and we're going to talk about some of the business aspects here, but all of the responsibilities, the liability, the paperwork requirements, the telephone calls, all of that is going to fall on your shoulders when you are in private practice. Some people will talk about that they really feel like they're on an island and don't have good clinical support. So many of us will reach out and have other therapists that we can call for case consultations. Or again, you might have that in a structured setting with a larger practice. The other thing that is important to keep in mind as you're starting your practice is that it takes time to build a practice, to be able to get a full caseload with whatever it is that you're looking to do. Income is really variable when you start. You might do a sliding scale with some clients. You might not yet be taking insurance. You might find that a client that is paying you then doesn't pay. And so there's a lot of instability at the very beginning, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then the flexible hours is great, but you also have to think about when people are looking for services. And this is one of the reasons why people often take full-time jobs within an agency or a health system, because you're going to work 9 to 5. Well, in private practice, most of the work is happening on the evenings and weekends, especially if you're doing this on a part-time basis. Next slide. All right, so here's some of your first educational pieces that in order to start a practice, this is a list of things that are must-haves. You are going to need to have an independent license to practice. You will need to sign up for liability insurance. Most of the professional associations have arrangements that you can get that. So for example, my liability insurance is through the NASW retention group. I'm not at all endorsing them. It's just one of the options that I have. When you work for an organization, the organization carries all of that liability. The organization bills under a tax ID number. And when you switch to private practice, that ownership comes to you. Getting an EIN or a TIN is something that you will do as a business owner. That's not just for therapists, that's for all businesses. But specific in the healthcare field, you'll also have to get an NPI, a National Provider Identifier number. It's possible you already have one of those if you have been working in a healthcare setting, especially if they've been billing insurance, Medicaid, Medicare. So you might want to check with your employer about that. Separating your personal banking from your business account is also going to be important. And you also are going to need to have a very clear plan about how you're going to maintain records for all of your clients. And a little bit later in the webinar, we're going to spend some time talking about that. Everything you do in private practice has to be HIPAA compliant. Again, when you work for an entity, someone else is typically responsible for managing that. But in private practice, all of the nuances associated with how to make sure that what you're doing follows HIPAA rules and regulations in your state and nationally, that is something that you're going to have to navigate. All right, next slide. So this is one of the foundational principles of what you're going to be doing as you're looking at starting a private practice. And developing a business strategy is really an important framework to think about, to consider yourself as a business owner. There are 4 different areas that I'm going to focus on as far as being able to develop a business strategy. It is usually recommended that a clinician will sit down and really sketch some of these things out prior to opening your door. And again, the more thoughtful you can be, the more you can increase the skills and your understanding of what it means to be a business owner, it's more likely you're going to be very successful in your practice. So let me cover 4 different items. Next slide, Kara. All right. The first thing is to know your niche. So in most organizational settings, many of us have been required to be generalists. We will take any client that comes to us. We have skills across a broad population base, and that is pretty standard in our field, especially as we're first getting started working on licensure supervision hours. In a private practice setting, though, you get to decide what it is that you really want to work on and specialize in your practice. And some of the most successful private practice owners are those who have a really strong brand or a niche in terms of what they do. Questions to ask yourself are listed here in terms of what is it that you really want to do, who want to work with, who do you want to work with? What have you gotten additional training on? Being able to call yourself an expert is something that sometimes we shy away from. But in truth, if you've been working in a particular program or with a specific population for quite some time, you probably have an area of practice that you're really good at. And that may be something that you're going to want to focus on. One of the things that you can do if you're not quite sure how to establish your brand or your niche is that you can take a look at really what is happening in your area. You might want to set up a meeting with someone who does perhaps take care of the clients that you're interested in, or you might even want to think about what are some of the gaps that your practice might uniquely be able to close. Next slide. Getting clients. What is your plan? A really strong business plan is going to outline a goal for a goal and the objectives of how you're going to get there. Networking is always in this profession the best way to be able to get clients. Clients are our best source of locating other clients. A happy client tells their friends, their neighbor. That word of mouth referral is still absolutely the best way to be able to get clients. But when you're just starting, you don't have a lot of clients to be able to do that chain link to more. So it's great to be able to talk with other therapists. Other therapists who are in private practice are a great resource because they may not be able to take certain clients. Or again, once you've established your brand, you may have another therapist who says, you know what, this client isn't really the right fit for me, but I'm going to send them over to you because I think they're the right resource. For most of us, you are going to do some type of online marketing, and you'll have to make some decisions about how much you want to do of this and where you want to do it. So I listed 3 here. ZocDoc, Psychology Today, and Therapy Den are all very popular among therapists. Some of them have fees to be able to list a profile, others do not. And you really need to think about, as you're listing your profile, how you're going to set yourself up to sell what it is that you do, how you market yourself. That starts with how you name your practice. You want to be thoughtful about that. People could be searching for a marriage and family therapist in their particular area. And so you might want to have some of those keywords even in your name, and certainly on a website that you might develop or on your profile. Everything I've described thus far is about you getting your own clients, but the other option is that anytime that you contract with a company, they will often be the ones to send you and get you referrals. So again, that could be a local group practice or it could be a national group practice. But in most cases, one of the biggest benefits to those services is that once you have a contract as a practitioner, your ability to fill your caseload with the clients that you're looking for is going to be much more likely to happen. All right, next slide. I can't stress enough that being in private practice means that you are a business owner. So I really want folks to embrace the business of being in business. You do have to make choices about what type of business you're going to have. The 3 that I have listed on here, an LLC, a PC, or sole proprietorship, there are legal and tax and liability concerns associated with each of these. We're not going to go into that today, but it's definitely something that you want to talk to other practitioners. You may want to get legal or tax advice before you make a decision about each of these things. It is fairly easy to be able to establish yourself as an LLC, a PC, or a sole proprietor. And so don't be overwhelmed by those terms, but definitely do your homework before you make a decision. Being in business for yourself also means that you're going to be responsible for your own taxes. When I started my practice, I did get some tax advice from an accountant to help me make some decisions about how I was going to withhold some of my earnings to be able to make sure that I could pay taxes. Some tax accountants will advise for practitioners to pay taxes quarterly rather than once a year so that it doesn't hurt quite as much when you have that hit, but definitely encourage folks to get some tax advice as you're looking at setting up your practice. This third point here is really important. A lot of us are uncomfortable talking about money, being able to talk about rates, collections, no-show fees, being able to hold clients accountable when they commit to paying for something. It's important that you work out any issues of your own that you might have, because when you're running a business, you are going to need to find ways to be able to focus on getting money in your bank account. And the last thing that I would say here is that it's also very important to know the liabilities that you're going to carry as a practitioner. That varies depending on if you're doing solo practice, group practice at the local level, or group practice at a national level. And so some of that liability is shared when you're entering into a group practice, but it's all on your own when you are a sole proprietor. And so again, this is where the more you can hone your business skills, knowledge, and understanding, the more likely you are to be able to have a smooth process as you run through these different stages of building your practice. Next slide. So I mentioned money before. I'm going to take it one step further and say it's really important to sketch out a P&L. You want to know what a P&L is. So if you need to be able to Google, take a webinar, a class, but knowing your profit, knowing how to develop a profit and loss spreadsheet, there's templates online that you can find, is going to be really important so that you can more accurately predict how much money you are going to make. The American Psychological Association and the National Association of Social Workers, interesting because different professions, both estimate that the average income for private practitioners is around $100,000 a year. That's based on an average $80 an hour hourly rate with 25 clients a week for a practitioner working 50 weeks a year. That's revenue. That does not include the ramp up period when you don't have 25 clients a week. It doesn't include sliding scale, pro bono. It doesn't include when you don't have 25. I think I just said that. So it's important that you be very realistic about what you hope your goal is going to be, and then also what the reality could be. Year one, sometimes year two is like a roller coaster for most new practitioners. And I just want to be realistic with folks as you set that out, that it can take time to ramp up your practice. Every practitioner has to decide what your rate is going to be, or if you're contracting with another organization, it's what's the rate you're willing to accept. You also have to make decisions about whether or not you are only going to accept cash pay, or if you are going to go through the process of getting paneled with insurance. And so these are decisions that you have to make that are all going to have a direct impact on your revenue. Now, this list of expenses is just one that I put together. There's other things that you can probably think of that are not on this list, but it's likely that you'll need to get some billing support if you are working as a sole practitioner. Those marketing expenses associated with putting your profile up or creating a website, those are things that you can plan on. You may have office rent that you're paying. And if you offer both in-person and telehealth, now you have office space that you have to rent, and you have to have really strong technology set up at home, whether that's excellent high-speed Wi-Fi or a speaker or a good camera, things like that. In this day and age, that's really a requirement as you're getting started. I listed some other expenses on here that you should anticipate. Google Voice is a great service, but you usually have to sign up for it. Software, and I have a slide in just a minute, we're going to talk about that. Software has a lot of variation in terms of the expenses that you might accrue. CEUs, as you all know, sometimes they're free, sometimes they're very expensive, but these are all expenses that are associated with your practice. In addition, those are all expenses that you can work with a tax accountant to be able to include as part of a write-off with your business. So there are lots of different categories you want to pay attention to. And again, that's why I recommend having everything documented on a spreadsheet and to really be able to track this very closely. All right, next slide. So I'm going to cover in these next few slides some of the logistics that are decision points that you need to make, and to a certain extent, liabilities that you need to pay attention to. Most of us who are going into private practice have heard of this body called CAQH. It's the Council for Affordable Quality Healthcare. CAQH is the centralized way to get credentialed on multiple different panels. It's a little bit of a headache. I'll talk about that in just a sec. But you also have to think about these other components. And so let me run through a couple of these real fast. Kara, next slide. Thank you. So one of the first decisions that you'll want to make is, are you going to decide to get on insurance panels? I have seen a number of friends who have started their practice as cash pay, and while they're working on getting paneled at other places, you can see that when you try and do this on your own, it takes time. And so it gives you an opportunity as you're starting to see, well, how many people can you actually get that are private pay, cash pay? You also, if you are going to decide to get paneled on different insurance companies, some people decide only to get paneled on one. And really master and focus their referrals with that one company, whereas others will decide to get paneled on a lot of different insurance companies. The CAQH application is very tedious. It has to be exactly filled out correctly with no gaps in dates. It is, well, it is a system. Let's just leave it at that. When you contract with a company like Path will do a lot of that. You have to still provide the details, but Path will manage the CAQH process for you. And there are credentialing teams. This happens, the same thing with regular employers in health systems, but the credentialing teams can get things done very, very quickly. And so that's, again, one of the decision points to make. However, if you are on a CAQH platform, when you do that, you are going to have to do reattestations every 120 days. So if you're managing it on your own, those emails are going to come to you. You're going to need to make sure to stay up to date, which allows you to continue to be credentialed with the insurance companies. So I only emphasize that because it's not a one and done. It is an ongoing item that comes up for folks to be aware of. And a lot of people shy away from insurance panels, and there are some very good reasons for shying away. But in this day and age, there's also some really good reasons why it does make sense for our profession to be on insurance panels. A lot of clients do not want to pay cash for an appointment. They want to be able to go through their health insurance and see somebody who's really good at the work that they do. And there's no reason why we can't work on ways to be able to make that happen so that more people have access to what is essentially an affordable service for them when they go through their insurance. It does take hours and hours of time to be able to get on panels and to deal with audits, any denials. There are some scary things that come up with potential insurance panels. And I think it's important for people to go into this with eyes wide open. So let me go to the next slide. You are going to need some sort of software when you are launching a practice. The ones that I have listed here, Simple Practice, Theranest, and Therapy Notes, have different levels of plans. They offer each of the different bullet points on the left in varying capacities. So some of them, for example, offer a client portal, some don't. Some of the software will do an eligibility of benefits, others don't. Sometimes you have to pay extra for these things. Most people are pretty happy with the three products, the software products that you see here on the right, although these are only for small private practices. And so once you start going into a larger group practice, you won't have a system like this because these software systems are not built for large volume practices. But this is something that you'll want to take a look at, that you want to compare these three plus others and talk to people to see which of the features they're actually using. Next slide. I am a compliance officer and have spent quite a bit of my career in this space. And so I would be remiss not to call out that you really want to pay attention as a private practitioner to how you are managing your client or patient privacy. If you are working from home, you're going to need a very private, confidential space. You might need a sound machine. You want to make sure that you have a way to secure your files, that you're not sharing your laptop that has PHI on it with other members of your family. Email communication is one of the first things that most practitioners look into as they're looking at starting their practice. These are 4 different services that our providers at Path have told me that they use and have good experiences with. Most of them are very affordable and just offers you that extra way to be able to communicate. But it doesn't stop at email. When you are running your own practice, you're also going to have a notice of privacy practices. You'll need to have a release of information form available. And ultimately, you are going to need to follow all of the laws for HIPAA in your state. Record retention is something that, as you step into private practice, is a whole new ballgame. You have to be able to retain records a minimum of 6 years after the last session with a client. And as you're, again, looking at those software that we just talked about on the last slide, you want to keep that in mind in terms of how you're going to be able to keep records. You also have to be able to release a record and to be able to produce that when a client, a payer, or an external party requests that with a valid ROI. And so again, being able to follow all these rules and regulations are something that's really important for practitioners to think of. All right, next slide. The last and probably one of the most important things that I want to mention is how to perfect your paperwork. Documentation, when you work for an organization, a health entity, everyone is telling you exactly what documentation you need to do. Many people are running from the massive amounts of documentation that are required in different health settings and really feel like, oh, well, in private practice, it won't be such a burden. There is a lot of truth to that, but at the same time, it is a liability on your part to make sure that your paperwork is meeting all of the requirements that you need to be able to deliver care. If you don't get your paperwork right, whether it's from some of those HIPAA issues or the audits that I'm going to talk about in just a sec, you do run the risk that it could impact your license, and it could impact also your profitability of your practice. Next slide, please. The requirements that you see on the left, most of us are familiar with these things. You're going to have informed consent documents. If you're going to collect a no-show fee, you need to have a policy that your clients sign off on. Some of these are HIPAA related. Many of these are coming from a code of ethics in your practice. Those are pretty straightforward. The piece that you want to pay attention to, though, is how you're documenting your initial assessment, your progress notes, and your treatment plans. There are clinical, ethical, and payer concerns that come up in regard to how you document. I made a mistake when I first opened private practice that I really wasn't doing much with treatment plans. They were so heavy in the organization I worked with that I was just so relieved not to have to do that. The risk here, though, is that when you're in private practice, either a client or if you take commercial insurance, they can request the record at any time. And every note that you write, you're always writing it with medical necessity in mind, that this is something that is truly required by a licensed clinician in order to be able to provide a service. But in addition, you want to make sure that your records are strong enough to hold up for if the client requests it for disability claim, workers' comp. It could be subpoenaed by an attorney. And then more importantly, if you're contracted with commercial insurance and if you are not working through a large group practice, you have to be prepared for an audit. Payers do request from private practitioners records, and you have to release those. You're legally required at any point. Payers are doing more reviews of the standards of care and whether or not the required elements are in notes for the initial assessment, progress, treatment plans, and to make sure that the service you're providing is something that is clinically appropriate. If a provider requests a record, does an audit, it's possible that they could claw back payments that they have already made to a private practitioner. And this is something that's a little bit scarier that a lot of people don't think of in terms of when you're on your own. Again, that responsibility comes to you. The other risk is that if you have a clawback and you have to pay back funds that were already paid to you, you also could be put on what's called a prepayment review, which means that the insurance company essentially wants to review every note before they decide if you're going to pay you. So again, national practices offer some protection against this, but in private practice, these are realities that you should be aware of. So next slide. Just to sum it up, what we're really talking about here is, are you going to make a decision to go out and open a private practice on your own? Or are you going to look at doing it with some support from any type of group practice model? Personally, I have loved being able to be in private practice, to be my own boss, to be able to determine how many clients I want to see at any given time. But if I could start it all over again, or if I was new, I think I would evaluate my decisions a little bit differently. There's just so many different resources out there now for private practice that you can still be a business owner, but get some of the support, the administrative support, some of the liability off your plate, some of the insurance headaches. You can actually delegate that and let somebody else be able to do that for you. There are ways to be able to have sort of the best of both worlds and to be able to make decisions that work for you. Kara, can you go to the next slide, please? PATH is one of those solutions, and these are some of the value propositions that we have in terms of the services that a company like PATH offers to providers. And we are a full service group practice that will get you referrals, negotiate rates, take care of all the insurance issues, store the medical record for you, be able to do all of these administrative end-to-end support to make sure that all you as a clinician do is take care of your clients. And so I really want to emphasize that, again, PATH is one option. Building a private practice is building a business. And so you are just becoming a business owner, building those skills, and really want to make sure that you're being deliberate in your decision-making process so that you can be really, really successful as you join. So I am going to wrap up and turn it over to questions and anything that I can help with the group. Kara, if you want to go to the next slide. We are going to hold that we have information. If you are interested in learning more about PATH, we do have a link that you can go to, but more so, I'd love to be able to take the slides down and just be able to talk about any questions that you might have.
Great. And I see one question. I'll pass it to you now, Cynthia. But if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will get to it. So the first question is, what happens if you don't pass an audit?
Yeah, so audits are not all black and white. So a lot of times you can pass part of an audit, but not another. If you are in your own private practice and you get what is ultimately a scary letter from a payer, it's very likely that they could put you on that prepayment review, which means that you have to essentially submit your notes prior to being able to get paid. There is a possibility that they could take back monies that you've already been paid. And so I have seen some practitioners who have really had a hard time with audits. It is a really good idea to talk to the insurance company directly rather than just relying on a letter that comes through. So great question. Definitely something to pay attention to. Again, if you're working with a group practice, the group practice gets audited, not the individual practitioner. And so that's one of the things about when you're working with another practice for your insurance needs. That's something that gives a little bit of protection for providers.
Perfect. Thanks. The next one we have is, do you have suggestions on where to get forms and documents for patients to sign at initiation of treatment, ROI, billing expectations, et cetera?
Yeah, so a lot of those software programs that I listed have those forms as part of their package. And so as you do an inventory for looking at which software platform, some of them even have messaging that you can send the forms directly from the software platform. And then obviously, if you're working with a group practice, it's the group practice's responsibility to be able to use those forms. The thing you want to be careful with is that there are state level requirements that vary. And so sometimes the software companies are national and they may not have something specific with your state. So it would be a really good idea to check with your licensing board. Some licensing boards have resources and links, or to be able to go through the professional association, whether that's marriage and family therapists, NASW, NBCC, to go through an organization to see if they have them. What I do not recommend you do is to just use the ones that were in place at an agency or that you got from another provider, because we tend to see that it's really important for you to have the forms that work for your practice. But there's definitely some good resources out there to be able to track those down.
All right, I got another one for you. So if you start with an agency such as PATH and they get you paneled and then decide to go out on your own, do you need to get repaneled with the insurance groups?
You do. You have to get all of your CAQH updated, because what happens typically when you're with a company like PATH is that in most cases, we are managing the CAQH process, doing all of those reattestations, and we attach the work that you're doing. So PATH is the billing provider. You are the rendering provider, but PATH is the billing provider. That is all connected through CAQH with the different insurance panels. So if and when you leave any type of practice, even as you move from one employer to the next, every time that happens, there has to be a reapplication that goes into the payer.
Great. Ooh, I love this question. It's coming up. Maybe we should make this too. So do you know of any handbooks for people who are interested in being in private practice?
I do, and this is not a planted question, but I keep a book near me. There's a woman by the name of Barbara Griswold who does, she has this book, Navigating the Insurance Maze. Sorry, it almost feels too planted, but it wasn't. Barbara's book is about the insurance process, but it is a goldmine, and it is not just about commercial insurance. It's really about setting up a very ethical and compliant practice in general. There are a couple of other books out there that I don't know. I'm not remembering the name offhand, because Barbara is my go-to for so many things. But you can definitely, if you Google and look on Amazon, you will see other books about starting your own private practice. I just really like Barbara Griswold's work, because I feel like that if you think about how complicated commercial insurance is, it's setting such a high standard that some of these other pieces and parts, that if you decide not to take commercial insurance, it still gives you a really solid foundation for what you should have in your practice, even if it's exclusively cash pay.
Great. All right, well, I don't see any more questions for you, Cynthia.
All right. Well, we're right about time, which is great. And I'm grateful that folks were able to join. I hope that this is useful for folks who might be listening later. And I hope that for each person who is going to take the plunge, the leap into private practice, that you have a better sense of some of the business skills and practices and what it is that would make you really successful.
All right, we have one more question. Actually, sorry, I jumped the gun. We have 1 minute.
Okay.
What are your thoughts about doing a 100% virtual practice?
I think that you can be very successful as 100% virtual. When you're licensed in a state, it gives you a range to be able to get such a broad scope of clients, as opposed to people who literally can get to your office in person. And so many practitioners since the pandemic have made the transition to 100% fully remote practice and are doing quite well.
Beautiful. All right. It's a wrap. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day.